Welcome. Welcome. My name, welcome. Before I start, again, I apologize for that. It's my first experience with Zoom bombing. And I really do apologize for the language and the images if you had to see them at the end. This is the new world. We're going to keep everybody muted. If you want to speak, you have to go to the participants button on the bottom of your screen, and then under more, is that correct? Sam, why don't you,
Yes, so we have forcibly muted everyone, so you do not have the option to unmute yourselves. So when we move into the conversation portion of our reading group today, if you want to speak, just drag your mouse over to the manage participants icon on the bottom of the Zoom screen. It's the two heads, and then you can click on more and raise hand, and then Roger and I will see that you want to say something and we will unmute you, and then when you're done talking we'll remute you, and that way we won't have any unwanted interruptions, and I apologize as well.
Yeah. All right, so Sam, you'll keep admitting people as they come in. Again, apologies. We will continue to we will probably have to use this admit function going forward, and I didn't want to have to do that, but I guess the world is we have to do that. So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I am the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. We are currently making our way through this book, Hannah Arendt's Men in Dark Times. The last two essays that we had read were on the novelist and poet Hermann Broch and the essayist, literary critic Walter Benjamin. And one of the interesting things about those two essays is that both Broch and Benjamin were close friends of Hannah Arendt. And her writing of those essays encountered them as friends in different ways. In the sense that for Broch, even though she had serious reservations about some of his philosophical thinking, she felt a duty out of loyalty to write the essay. Whereas for Benjamin, she, in a sense, was so close to him, and in many ways so closely in agreement and sympathy with him, that a question emerged of where Arendt begins and ends. This essay on the poet and playwright, and we might, Bertolt Brecht, is quite different in that regard. Hannah Arendt was not a friend of Bertolt Brecht's. She writes to her friend, Gershom Scholem, that she never liked Brecht in June of 1950. She wrote, "I didn't meet Brecht. I never liked him. Moreover, he certainly resents my article in the Rundschau for obvious political reasons." The article she has in mind in the Rundschau was Der Dichter Bertolt Brecht, the poet Bertolt Brecht, which came out in 1950. It was published in English as Beyond Personal Frustration, so she had written, and again, it was critical of Brecht. It was actually her second article on Brecht. She had written another one earlier. So she has three essays on Brecht, and this one that we're reading now is the third. I should say, just from a interesting biographical note, Hannah Arendt was arrested in 1933 for doing research for the Zionists, and that was the main reason she was arrested. But part of what led the authorities to her as well is that her then husband, Gunther Stern, later Gunther Anders, was friends with Brecht, or at least acquaintances with him, and was in Brecht's address book, so that when Brecht was found by the Nazis, Gunther Anders had to go into hiding and eventually go to Paris, and that led to Arendt herself eventually making her way to Paris. The background, this is a difficult essay. Patchen Markel, an Arendt scholar, wrote that it is one of the most passionate essays Arendt ever wrote, yet its intensity has made it difficult to interpret. And I think that's a very accurate statement. A little background that actually is very helpful in Patchen Markel's article is that when it came out, this article on Arendt, by Arendt on Brecht, it was seen by many people as an attack on Brecht. It was read within the time period as an anti-communist essay, an attack on Brecht as communist, and Arendt's essay was seen as a j'accuse, an accusation against Brecht, and that led to a lot of criticisms of her for in a sense being a cold warrior against someone like Brecht. But Arendt's essay is not that kind of an essay. It's not an attack on Brecht. It's much more subtle than that. She does take seriously what she calls his sins, and they are many. And one of the things we have to try and figure out is what are the sins. And to guide us, there's a couple of lines. Arendt says repeatedly, a poet's real sins are avenged by the gods of poetry. And she quotes Goethe saying, Dichter sündigen nicht schwer, or poets don't shoulder such a heavy burden of guilt when they misbehave. But this is addressed to indiscretions and not crimes or sins, she says. So how do we judge a poet? How do we judge someone like Bertolt Brecht? Is he allowed his sins? What are his sins? Just to be clear, his sins are that, to some degree, he was an apologist for both Hitler and Stalin, and in doing so, made himself useful to totalitarian regimes, and so that's a fairly strong accusation. Arendt says it's not as bad as someone like Ezra Pound, who active, or Paul Celine, who actively preached anti-Semitism and supported Hitler and Nazism, but it's pretty bad to excuse totalitarianism. And so she says the case of Bertolt Brecht, and she actually names it the case of Bertolt Brecht, she says, is a concern to all citizens who wish to share their world with poets. And this is because there is such thing as a chronic misbehavior of poets and artists, from Plato to Ezra Pound to Celine to Heidegger. Poets sin, they do bad things, and at times, she says, they can sin so gravely that they must bear their full load of guilt and responsibility. But she also says, along with Goethe, that Goethe was right, that more is permitted to poets. They have more leniency than the rest of us. And we have to judge their sins by listening to their poetry. So that's the effort of the essay in some ways, to judge Bertolt Brecht's sins as a citizen. How do we as citizens judge someone like Bertolt Brecht? The first point I want to make is that Arendt wants to say when and why Brecht's poetry is great when it is great. And so this is the attempt to sort of first make the case that Brecht is worth taking seriously. He's triply a member of what she calls three lost generations, born between the he was born in 1898, so the 1890s to the 1920s. The first generation was the one who went through World War I and the destruction, the true destruction of World War I. He actually served as an orderly in World War I. Then the second went through the inflation of the 20s after the wars. And the third generation obviously dealt with the Nazi period. These most poets of this time, in this lost generations, she says, were concerned with themselves. They were worried about their own souls and what happened to them, and they forgot what mattered. This is on page 220. And here's where she begins to develop what I take to be her argument about why Brecht is a great poet. It is that for Brecht, he always held to dreams and the heavens. He always, he had, on page 220, she cites a poem from the Manual of Piety, an early book, where he says that he had forgotten his holy youth, but not its dreams. Long forgotten the roof, but never the sky above it. I'm not going to read all the poems in German just because I assume most of you don't know German. She's trying to do the best she can with the translations. But the point is that Brecht, for her, even though he was part of this lost generation, didn't wallow on his own self, on self-pity, except for one or two poems he doesn't write about himself. He doesn't write in the first person. Brecht instead found freedom from worldly purposes and cares, and he found a peculiar stillness of wonder and gratitude. And she says the one perfect product of his last years was a German nursery rhyme, which she says is untranslatable. But the point is, he didn't write about, his own soul. He was remote. He had an inclination toward anonymity. What set him apart, she writes on page 225 to 226, was that he realized how deadly ridiculous it would be to measure the flood of events with a yardstick of individual aspirations, to meet, for instance, the international catastrophe of unemployment with a desire to make a career. There's no sentimentality in his beautiful and beautifully precise definition of a refugee, ein Bote des Unglücks, an ambassador of ill tidings or of unhappiness. Refugees are ambassadors of ill tidings. They are ambassadors of the great misfortune of the world. And so what he writes about is, again, not himself or not an individual, not usually a character, but the world. And so she describes his penetrating, non-theoretical, non-contemplative intelligence. And she says a poet like Brecht is someone who must say the unsayable, who must not remain silent on occasions when all are silent, and who must therefore be careful not to talk too much about things that all talk about. What Brecht said in his poetry and plays was the impossible task of loving a world amidst catastrophe, amidst the dark times. And so we get to this idea of the love of the world, amor mundi, which Arendt, in some of her own writing, says is the most difficult thing of all. And then here on pages 228 through 230 or so, she sort of really delves deeply into this idea and says that Brecht was part of this lost generation. He was part of a world living amidst dark times or catastrophe. A world that was trackless and in a void, where all the instruments were broken, the break in tradition, the decline of the nation state, the turn from classes which pursued political interests to masses which were anonymous and basically had no interest but simply wanted identity and therefore were mobilized through mass totalitarian movements. And of course, spiritually, the rise of nihilism. And it's amidst this sense, she says, that all firm standards and solid guideposts for moral conduct are wiped away. that Brecht had a unique reaction, different from the other poets of his age. He fell in love with life, with theirness. He wrote about pirates and adventurers. He so loved life that he affirmed death and destruction. In his Ballad of Mazep, which she says are truly immortal lines of German poetry, I'll read her rough translation of a few of these lines. One man rode out with the things that were most his own, with earth and horse, with endurance and silence. Then he was joined by vultures and sky. For 3 days he rode through evening and morning until he was old enough not to suffer anymore. When saved and tired to death, he rode into the great shelter, into eternal rest. And she describes this as a glorious, triumphant vitality amidst the death song, that it was fun to be alive even amongst the world falling off its tracks. That there was in Brecht a love of the world, a gratitude for the earth and sky. And she says, nowhere else, this is on page 233, nowhere else in modern literature is there such a clear understanding that what Nietzsche called the death of God does not necessarily lead into despair, but on the contrary, since it eliminates the fear of hell, can end in sheer jubilation, in a new yes to life. And so I take the second part of the essay and the first, I think, substantive part to be making this argument that what makes Brecht a poet in some way is his ability to say the unsayable, to speak the joy and gratitude and love of life and love of the world amidst the horrors of nihilism. What brought Brecht back to reality, she says, and almost killed his poetry was compassion. Compassion, which we don't usually think of in a negative term, is for Arendt always a problematic idea. She writes a lot about compassion and pity in other essays, especially in On Revolution. But for her, what compassion is it's what one offers to those others that he or she refuses to help, right? I mean, that's the important understanding of compassion. We are compassionate for the poor, and we feel for them, and we have pity for them when we don't actually help them, when we don't give them money, when we don't give them a better life. And so compassion for her is always from those on high down below, and it actually makes us feel good about ourselves without actually having to sacrifice in any way. And so she says that there's a great temptation of compassion which underlies all 20th century, all modern revolutions, which is to be good. To be good or compassionate is a terrible temptation. And so she says there's actually a double temptation involved here. On the one hand, there's the terrible temptation to be good / and to do nothing, because our goodness excuses our inaction. And there's also the terrible temptation to ignore the horrors and pass by with a distracted ear, to say nothing. And so she says that Brecht suffered from this compassion, and that to a large degree, he was tempted to be good and to do nothing. That compassion overwhelms his remoteness and his sense of reality and truth. And so she sees his decision to align himself with the Communist Party, which she says, by the way, was easy to understand at the time that he did it. Aligning with the Communist Party was not a terrible thing. The Communist Party was actually a party that was out there to do good. But so his sin wasn't that he became a communist, because to be a communist, she says, in the 20s and the early 30s was not a sin. It was merely an error. It's her words. But the problem was not just joining the Communist Party, but when he found out that in order to change the world, it was not enough to be good, you had to also be bad yourself. So out of compassion, you came to excuse evil. And so Brecht's troubles, she said, started when he became enraged. This is on page 246. When he tried to be more than a voice, which is how he began. So the point is, when he began, he was a voice, first for joy and for love of the world, and then maybe even a voice where he didn't pass by, where he was a voice for horrors. But eventually, a voice, he became a voice, and he lost his remoteness, and poets need remoteness. And the two poems or plays, actually, that she develops, I guess to some degree, her claim that Brecht sinned, and that he was, and that his sin overwhelmed his poetry, through two plays. One is The Measures Taken, and the other is The Burial of the Agitator in the Zinc Coffin. In The Measures Taken, it's a play about Stalin's trial, truth trials. And she says in Brecht's case, it was not so serious that he wrote The Measures Taken in order to glorify a totalitarian party, because what he did is he told the truth. It's actually an amazing play, she says. He told the hideous truth. Which truth was it? The truth that innocent people need to be sacrificed for political goals, right? For those of you who've read Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, you'll see this with an utter clarity, but I mean, it's also just part of the historical record. The claim is the party is always right. The party sees with 1,000 eyes. We see, of course, only with 2 eyes. And we may think we're right. We may be innocent, but the party knows better. And if we oppose the party, we oppose progress, and we oppose truth. And it's not just that Brecht told this truth, this hideous truth, namely that these people needed to be killed, but he tried to come to terms with it. He actually excused it. He was willing to excuse Stalin's killing of innocents in the name of communist progress. Similarly, and so she says Brecht lied. And what was the lie? Well, she then develops the lie. The first lie is he lied that that we can reconcile ourselves to such a world in which such hideous truths are justified. And then the second play that she talks about is The Burial of the Agitator in the Zinc Coffin. And here this concerns bringing communists who were in concentration camps, and importantly, concentration camps and not death camps, a distinction Arendt makes, back to Germany to be buried in zinc coffins that were not allowed to be opened. And what Brecht does is he makes the problem with Hitler the fact that these communists were killed, not the fact that they were killed by torture, lawlessness, and totalitarian methods. And she says, this was a double lie, right? That first of all, the opponents, he didn't say that the opponents were beaten to death. And he also wanted to say that in some sense, there was just a measure of degree between a capitalist government and a communist totalitarian government. And so what she says is, it's in these poems and these plays that Brecht loses his poetic gift. The end of the essay raises this question of equality or of justice. And she says that normally we think of justice as lawfulness. And therefore, since Brecht sinned, he should be judged a sinner. But she says justice is more complicated than that. There's also the question of forgiveness. And in forgiveness, we don't judge everyone equally. There's a kind of inequality. We take the person into account. It matters who you are and how you are as to whether we will forgive you or not. And so she cites the Roman proverb, quod licet Jovi, non licet bovi. What is permitted to Jove is not permitted to the ox. And she says poets are permitted more, and we may forgive poets for certain sins. But then at the end, she has this interesting reversal where she says, what is permitted to the ox is not permitted to Jove, to the gods. Mere intellectuals, mere literati, as she calls it, are oxes. And we don't punish them for their lack of talent or their loss of talent, but we also don't call them poets either. And then she ends, I think, the essay quite ambiguously or equivocally. And she says, what Brecht did was not permitted to Jove. And this shows how difficult it is to be a poet in this century. And so I take it that she ends in a way with a real question of whether Brecht was a poet in the end, or whether he lost his title as a poet by his sins. I think it's an ambiguous end. Clearly, she thinks quite highly of much of his poetry, but she takes seriously his sins as well. As I said, it's a difficult essay. I don't claim to have a hard and fast reading of exactly where she comes out. The Brecht's poetry is quite difficult. Some of it's untranslated here, maybe untranslatable. But I'll stop there. And given our Zoom bombing problem, I don't know, Sam, if you still think we have a Zoom bombing problem, but maybe we should move to the chat as a way of doing questions, or do you want to, or should we unmute people as they have questions?
I will unmute people as they raise their hands so they can ask questions.
Can you remind people how, I see a question from Amaury Reyes-Torres, but remind people how to ask questions again, how to raise their hands.
Sure, so just if you want to ask a question, you can either type it in the chat box, which I've been watching, or you can drag your mouse over to manage participants, click on the icon, and then click on more at the bottom. It's the third all the way to the right, and then click raise hand, and then we'll see who's raising their hand and we can call on you. If you would like to take a moment to rename yourself, which you can also do with the 3 dots at the upper right hand corner. If you haven't, that's also helpful. So I will use the name instead of a number. So Amaury, you have a question. I've unmuted you.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Sam. I have 2 questions very much involved with the general thought of Hannah Arendt and the essay. The first one will be why she takes this stance regarding what it's a poet and why we should lead away a poet's action, or why being a poet is so important. And I try to connect this with the idea of, I mean, she thinks, and I can put some words into her mouth because she's not here, but I think she thinks that being a poet means that you are thinking, right? And if you think and you're more able to distinguish what you're doing good and try not to fall into the paradox of choosing evil or lesser evil. And when you compromise yourself like that, you cannot be a poet in that pure essence of the word that I think she's trying to put forth. And the second question, it's more regarding the I think how can we then, and it's pretty much involved with the Benjamin's essays as well, is how can you just set a line or separation between being an artist and at the same time be politically involved? And Brecht here, he made a decision to be involved politically in a way, but why should we just look at him as a political actor and not still looking at him as a poet, or the other way around? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, in this essay, Arendt addresses the question of why being a poet might be important. Insofar as she says that what a poet does is says what is, or says the unsayable. You know, the line "to say what is a line I think from Herodotus that she cites in many places, and it's really very much her ideal of what someone like a poet or a writer or an artist does. You know, the role of art in her thinking is very important. She's an aesthetic thinker in many ways. And so just to give a quick recap, at the end of the work chapters of the human condition, Arendt again raises the question of art, which is the highest or the most pure idea of what it means to do work, the artist. What an artist does is put something into the world, whether it's a sculpture or a building or a poem, and that thing that rests, that in Latin rests, that thing is a thingification, a reification. A reification is a making material or making artificial of a thought, of a thing. It's a thought thing, she'll say. And it then becomes part of our common world. And so poets are deeply essential for Arendt, not only poets, but artists, because they say what is, but they also, in saying what is, thingify it and make it part of the world, the common shared world that we have. And, you know, as part of that idea, one of the things that she develops very clearly in this essay, but it's also in, again, almost all the other essays she writes about art, is the need for the poet or the thinker to stand back, to not be engaged in the sort of in the social and political world, to be an observer, to be hidden, and what she calls an intentional pariah, conscious pariah, to consciously not take place in the aim for fame or riches or desires, and success, because it's that distance, that remoteness, that anonymity that allows the thinker to see the world from a fresh perspective, to see it differently, and then develop a new, fresh idea that they can then put in the world, in a work of art, in a poem, in a sculpture, in a painting, or in a building, such that that work will surprise people and get them talking and become part of a new world. And so she takes the import of poetry incredibly seriously. Her worry, and one she expresses over and over again through many different in many different venues, is that when poets move from this remoteness to a kind of engagement, they lose their ability to be great artists, because they don't have the original vision of standing apart and back, but also they risk justifying evil, and instead of saying what is, seeking to excuse what is. Samantha has also written a fair bit on Arendt's poetry, and I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sam, at this point.
No, I think that, you know, some comments have come up about the thingification of the world. Just to echo, you know, it's literally the making object of the world, and poetry for Arendt is the form of making, poesis, that is closest to thinking in the way that it materializes in the world because of the density of the language. Dict, verdict, das Gedicht. It's the thickness and the density, the condensation of the poetic language, which makes it resilient. But maybe just to also tie it into one of the questions about how does Arendt's criticism compare with Arendt's criticism, Arendt's reading of Brecht compare with her reading of Heidegger, yeah, which is a great question. And I'll just say one thing on it, is, you know, Arendt was in part criticized. You know, this essay caused a huge controversy, which unfolded in the pages of the New Yorker, and there were responses to it. And as Roger said, she was criticized for apologizing for Stalinism. And one of the arguments that Arendt makes towards the end is that, you know, poets get this pass in a way because they're removed from the world, right? In order to do the work of writing poetry, they're not participating in the plane of political action, and so their judgment is off. They can't read clearly the realm of political affairs. And I think in that way, her reading of Brecht is somewhat akin to her reading of Heidegger on philosophy, but I'm sure Roger also has a reading of that. And we have questions from Nancy and Jack, if you want me to.
I mean, we should go to the questions. I'll say I think Sam is right. I mean, her reading of Heidegger is quite similar. Heidegger is a brilliant thinker who goes wrong, as she says, when he tries to enter the world of politics. This is a common theme in her work, and so you know, we can talk about Heidegger another time. But yes, can you? Yeah, Nancy.
Yeah, I think the first question, I think you sort of answered, which is, I was thinking about being a poet and the thingification, the poiesis and so on, as an act, and whether, you know, when she was talking about others who did acts in the world that were positive and that came out of their own thinking, whether she puts that on the same level as when a poet makes a poem that puts into the world something that comes out of his own thinking. So that was kind of I think I got that from both of your answers. But I had another question which has to do with, it's something Roger just touched on, which has to do with her fascination with the character and the character traits of these people that she's examining, and her tracking of the course of their life and what happens when they don't honor those traits or when something goes awry. She seems to be fascinated. There's a chronological thing that I'm beginning to get about a number of the figures in Men in Dark Times. And I just wondered if there's any other comment on that. Thanks.
Can you just say a little more, Nancy, about what chronological thing you've noted? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I feel as if she, in her analysis of the moments in his life and the times in his life and the way she correlates it with what's happening in the world that he's living in and how he's behaving within that world, when she feels as if he sins, it's sort of toward a later part of it's almost as if she has been delving into his character traits, but she's also examining him in a temporal setting.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
I've felt that happens in a number of her essays in this book.
I think with Brecht especially, it's a little complicated. I mean, she is so wrapped up in it and so passionately engaged in his poetry. And yet there are, you know, it goes back and forth, right? There's the early period where she clearly loves his love of life and gratitude for life. Then there's this period during the Nazi period where you know, he praises Hitler and says, look, Hitler has got rid of poverty, and Hitler has brought you know, a kind of social, you know, he's a National Socialist. And there was a way in which he excuses Hitler. But then he goes into exile, and he writes some great poems again in exile. And then, you know, he comes to the United States and writes some great poems. And then he always wants to go back to Germany, and then he finally gets back to East Berlin and he stops writing. So I don't know if it's a straight chronological move, and I don't know exactly how to characterize it. I think what she sees in him is clearly, I mean, in her words, a poetic gift, and yet and an ability to say what is and be remote, and yet at the same time a temptation to not only want good and see and say the good, but to actually excuse the bad in the name of the good, which pops up at different times. I don't know if that is an adequate answer to your question, and if someone wants to add to it, or if you want to add to it. You know, I think it's a very nuanced essay. And I think, as Sam said, when it was originally read, it was read as very critical of Brecht. I think a lot of people today read it as very laudatory of Brecht. I think people are less worried about the communist, anti-communist aspects. And they sort of, that because people aren't so caught up in that, and because honestly, many people who read Arendt are filled with compassion and often willing to excuse things that Arendt would not excuse in the name of doing good. They're not as critical of Brecht, and so it's sort of become, I think it's read today much more laudatory, but I think it's very nuanced. She's clearly torn, at least my reading of the essay. I'm happy to hear other people's view on that, because I'm not 100% confident of my own.
I think that's, I'll just add something quickly. I think that's right, but I think it also cuts to Arendt's distinction in the human condition between forgiveness and reconciliation, and how in this essay we get a lot of the language of forgiveness, which is for her something that's very personal, which she holds apart from reconciling oneself to the political and what is in the world. And I don't think I think part of the tension is that she's not trying to repair forgiveness and reconciliation in her reading of Brecht. She's offering an account of him, and we see both of those terms coming through in this essay, I think.
I think that's right.
Yeah, Jack has a question.
He's still muted. Can you unmute him?
I
don't know.
I am unmuting him, but it's not working. I don't know. Jack, are you?
I unmuted myself. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Well,
so
yep.
It's interesting that these last two comments were really touch on the thought that I had as when I completed reading this essay, which, as Roger says, is very complicated, especially for somebody like myself, who is a great admirer of Brecht's work, but knew nothing about his poetry whatsoever, just the theater. So, but I was thinking as I read this thing that she begins and ends on the question of forgiveness. That is, what we allow a poet to be, what we permit a poet how much we permit a poet to transgress, and she's clearly not decided about how much forgiveness is worth, any given individual is worth. So there's kind of like a range, and she describes it as a range. And I think that in this essay, she's trying to forgive herself for loving his work so much.
Huh.
I think that this is a way for her to express a cry for forgiveness for herself, because she knows how badly he acted, and that it's incumbent on her to criticize that behavior, but she cannot bring herself to do it because the poetry is so beautiful and possessing, and that she's conflicted in that way, and she's begging us to forgive her.
Yeah, maybe. I think she develops her thinking on forgiveness and reconciliation beginning in 1950 in a series of entries in the Denktagebuch, right after she comes back from seeing Heidegger in 1950 on her first trip back to Germany after the war, and she makes a distinction between revenge, forgiveness, and reconciliation. But what I've tried to argue in the past is that forgiveness is a kind of, she thinks, is actually problematic in some way, because to forgive someone is to sort of play God. God is who can forgive you. There's a kind of inequality in that, and if there's not, well, who am I to forgive? I don't think she forgives Heidegger for anything. I think what she tries to do is reconcile with Heidegger, and by reconciling, what she says is, we don't concern ourselves with his guilt. We release him and ourselves, and so what she says is, she came to believe that Heidegger's work and the importance of his work is worth being in the world, and his and therefore not worth being punished or excluded from the world. We love the world enough with Heidegger in it that we can reconcile him being in it even with his wrongs. Against that, someone like Eichmann, what she says is, I can't reconcile a world in which Eichmann continues to be in it, because to do so is an affront to the very plurality of the world. I think clearly she can reconcile to a world with Brecht in it. I don't think she sees what Brecht did as irreconcilable. The question that she's asking is less that one, and more, can we still call him a great poet? I think that's the question that she's really asking in that essay. Which I have to say, from my point of view, is a weird question. And I'm a little uncomfortable thinking that's what the question she asked, but I take that to be the question of the essay. And I think her answer at the end is very ambiguous, but I'm happy to hear. Does anyone else have isn't that the question? That's the question that, it's the question of, can we forgive Brecht his sins? And what she says is, the criteria is, does his poetry hold up? Is he a great poet? And the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. And I take that to be her answer. I don't know if people are satisfied with that.
David Bell has had his hand up for a while.
it's not directly, I suppose, I mean, just to respond to what you just said, I don't think I can quite go along with sometimes yes and sometimes no, because even great poets produce bad work for funny reasons. When I read it, I feel she thinks he's a very great poet. And I agree with you that she's a bit tormented. It's as if she can't, it's not so much that she can't forgive herself. I think it's she can't forgive Brecht for having such a truly great mind and going so terribly astray as she sees it. And so I think that's more the thing. But the other thing I wanted to say was about, related to also what you said about her attitude to the poet. And I think when she talks, I mean, she thinks one of the things that goes wrong with Brecht is becoming engagé. And the engagé is the ruin of a poet. And when she says that, she's saying that poet, stroke artist, has a certain entitlement, that their work comes before everything. And we, humanity, we benefit from that. The trouble is, of course, is that that judgment can never be made by the poet themselves. Mm-hmm. The poet doesn't make it as a judgment. The moment a poet says, well, look, I'm a poet, so I don't have to get involved in political work, although I know it's important because I've got something better to do. At that moment, they've perverted the understanding Arendt brings. Because Arendt, I think, it's a judgment that we make about the poet and their work. They can never make for themselves, but the poet finds themselves living the life that they have to live, driven by the only thing that matters to them, and that's the work, and that needs respecting. But it's not a kind of calculus of the poet. It's something that comes driven, that we respect.
That's absolutely right, David. I mean, and that's true for all action as well as art for Arendt, that the actor as well as the artist can't interpret their own action. They put it out in the world and they have to relinquish control of it, which is, you know, which relates to one of the main difference between what she calls reconciliation and forgiveness. In forgiveness, you forgive the person, right? In reconciliation, you make peace with what they did in the world. And so, you know, one way to think about this is to reconcile with Brecht is to reconcile with his poetry and say, you know, even though there were some bad poems and some dangerous poems and some sinful poems, the world is better off, or at least I accept the world. I can reconcile myself with the world with him in it. To forgive Brecht is something more. It's to, you know, exonerate him, to say that he was, that even if he was wrong, his wrong is forgivable. I think it's that move to forgiveness which she's raising and equivocating on here. You know, so on page 248, she talks about, again, justice as equality before the law. But then she moves to forgiveness, and forgiveness takes the person into account, which, by the way, reconciliation doesn't. And forgiveness, therefore, pardons not the murder, but the murderer. And we forgive somebody, not something. And then she has this great line where she says that, therefore, in forgiveness, there's always an inequality that applies that every man is or should be more than what he did or achieved. And then she cites the ballad about the secrets of each and every man, which ends, but strike him dead. Why not indeed, if he never amounted to anything more than the doer of his bad deed or the doer of his good deed. So he does good deeds, he does bad deeds, but we forgive those who amount to something more, right? And she says the standard here is inequality. Those who amount to something more are like Jove. Those who just are there, run of the mill are like oxes. And yet, then in the middle of that last paragraph, she says, the simple fact that he was capable of writing such unspeakably bad verse, and here you go, worse by far than any fifth-rate scribbling versifier who was guilty of the same sins, shows that quod licet bovi non licet Jovi, what is permitted to an ox is not permitted to Jove. Well, now what has she done? She's equated him with an ox, right? For whether or not you can praise tyranny in fine-sounding voices, it is true that mere intellectuals or mere literati, are not punished for their sins by loss of talent. No god leaned over their cradle, no god will take his revenge. There are a great many things that are permitted to an ox, but not to Jove. That is, not to those who are a bit like Jove, not to those who are a bit like Jove, or rather are blessed by Apollo. So what those who are a bit like Jove or blessed by Apollo are the poets. And to them, things are not that are permitted, those things are not permitted. That suggests that she's arguing that Brecht is not to be forgiven for his sins against poetry as a poet. And thus, she concludes, hence the bitterness of the old saying cuts both ways, and the example of poor B.B., who never wasted a shred of pity on himself, may teach us how difficult it is to be a poet in this century or at any other time. I take this to be a refusal of forgiveness. Basically, what she's saying here is he's not worthy of being forgiven. That doesn't mean we don't reconcile to him in his poetry. It doesn't mean some of his poetry is not great, but he proved himself not worthy of being given the permissiveness of Jove. I take that to be the point that she's making. Yeah, I'll stop there. And I'd ask you to some degree to think about this not only in relation to Brecht, although I'm glad we're really focused on the text. I actually really appreciate that. But what she's, the question she's talking about is, how do we as citizens judge poets, right? The case of Bertolt Brecht. And this case, this is on 218, this case is of concern to all citizens who wish to share their world with poets. Why? Because all poets, right, are going to be dangerous. I'll put it out there, right? Why are all poets dangerous? Because all poets speak in a language which is outside of normal. In order to be a great poet, you have to be a little abnormal. You have to be willing to flout the everyday standards. You have to be a bit of an outsider, a pariah. You can't be a great poet if you just versify what everyone thinks. You have to stand outside, which is why you have to be something what she calls a conscious pariah. And so we have to permit poets a certain latitude, a certain freedom. We have to say that more is permitted to poets than to ordinary mortals. And so because that's the case, we also, she's saying, as citizens, have to know when what the limits are, right? When a poet has reached the limit, at which point we should no longer and can no longer forgive them their eccentricities. You know, and she, you know, she says, you know, everyone knows he was sort of a cad, to use an old term, but that's okay, because to those whose business it is to soar must shun gravity. You know, we're not going to hold poets to petty bourgeois moral standards. I mean, I don't know how you all feel about that, but that's her claim, right? Poets don't need to be held to that standard. But she says there have to be some standards. And that's, you know, if you want to, well, I think there's a lot of incredibly beautiful and deep analysis of poetry in this text. I think the argument of the text is not about that. The argument of the text is, how do we judge poets? We need poets. They're the people who bring new ideas into the world, artists. But as Plato told us long ago, poets are dangerous. They're disruptive. They tear things apart. And we have to know, we have to have standards for judging the poet. As she says, the chronic misbehavior of poets and artists has been a political and sometimes moral problem since antiquity. Right? And she says the only way to determine unequivocally how great their sins are is to listen to their poetry. So that's her argument. We have to be able to judge poets, and the only way to do it is to listen to their poetry. Is it good or not? And that's why this is such a hard essay, because you're trying to listen to her judging Goethe's poetry. And, you know, a lot of it is her claims that this is the greatest poem of the age in German. And most of us don't have a context for that. Not all of us, I'm sure, but some of us. Are there?
There are a number of hands up, so maybe we should take two at a time, maybe Maeve and then Ken, and then we can pause and keep going.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think my question follows really well on the discussion you just said, which is, I was really interested in her use of the word tricky, or the trickiness of kind of, she recognized her own challenge about the language of Brecht. And I was wondering if, and I was interested in discussing this idea of trickiness and poetry, and the kind of dilemma. Poetry is tricky. It doesn't use language in a conventional sense. It is tricky with language. And that is part of what makes it meaningful, but that's part of what makes it open to interpretation and kind of the unlocking of the puzzle of the poem.
Yeah,
Whereas
Maeve, can you just tell me what page you're using? She uses tricky on? If you have a text that has page numbers?
I'm reading the Kindle version, so I don't think.
Oh, or what part is it in? Part 2, 3, 4, 5? Do you know?
Let's see.
If you can't find it, it's all right. I just thought it would help, but that's fine.
I think it's
Go ahead.
part 2.
Part 2, great.
Yeah.
And the word is tricky?
Yeah, let's see.
That's all right.
Sorry, I lost my. It's after the quote. It's where she's talking about Great Carthage and kind of the messenger of ill tidings bit. It's right after that.
Okay, I'll find that.
So first she says the very tricky way of thinking in this particular poem, and then later in the next paragraph she says illuminating trickiness.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just, wondering whether this kind of trickiness is kind of an essential character of poetry and of the poet. But once once a poem or something becomes an action, there's really no trickiness to it. You can't get away from the results or consequences of that action. So that is kind of, I feel like one of the dilemmas in becoming engagé is the kind of the fluidness, the trickiness, the slipperiness of the poem is lost. And that also, yeah, interferes with the identity of the poet. It made me think of the Greek concept of natis. And it's been a while since I've done research about that. But when you had mentioned poesis earlier, Samantha, that reminded me of the Matisse concept of like cunning intelligence. I wanted to hear if you guys had if anyone else was kind of noticing that.
It's a great question. Sam, should I just answer that and then go to Ken, or should we take two?
Yeah,
it's up to you.
Go for it. That's fine, and then we'll go to Ken.
Yeah, because I mean, I think to answer that, we have to do a little bit of the poem. I mean, this is in the section where she's really, developing her argument about what is so great about Brecht as a poet, and it's this ability to say what is from a remoteness that allows him to stand away and stand apart and say what is. And then what she says is, in this amazing account of what is a refugee, right, where she calls it a Bote des Unglück, a messenger of ill tidings. I mean, what a brilliant turn of phrase, that a refugee who travels across borders is not simply an exile or poor or needy or all the things that we get in the essay on refugee, but is a messenger of the misfortune of the world, of the great misfortune of the whole world, is like a coming premonition of all that's going to go crazily haywire. And she says this is the supreme gift of condensation, which is the prerequisite of all poetry. And here are a few more instances of his utterly condensed and hence very tricky way of thinking. So, I mean, the poem she gives, Hören die Reden, die aus deinem Häuser dringen, lacht man. So hearing the speech or the talk that comes out of your houses, people laugh. Aber wer dich sieht, but whoever looks at you or sees you, they grab their knives. And she says, this is about the shame of being a writer, a German writer in 1933. Is, on the one hand, we laugh at them, and on the other hand, we grab our knives to protect ourselves. I mean, and that you have to write in this kind of very condensed way that when you first read it, you're like, what is going on? But it makes you think. And I take that to be part of the power and joy of poetry. It's what it both allows poetry to say what is unsayable, to say what's beyond the ordinary. And it requires a kind of attentiveness, and a kind of gift and luck, as she'll say. So I think I think tricky is probably used here in a very positive way, almost like Hermes, the trickster god of sorts, if that's allowed. Maeve, I don't know. Is that, Maeve? Happy to tell you. Is that what you wanted, or were you after something else? Can you unmute yourself? Or I don't know if we can.
You're
unmute
unmuted, Maeve.
Yeah.
I unmuted you.
No, that's interesting. I think I want to align myself with her perspective on Brecht, I guess, and not forgive him as a person, but find a way to appreciate the poetry, which I just think, yeah, the kind of the mistake that he made was in thinking that he could, or not thinking, but taking on that engagé perspective, his his identity or his role in the world took on a more concrete argument about things instead of being a voice that was trying to kind of distill what was happening in the world and offer multiple kinds of meanings that people could take away from it. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's great.
Yeah.
Who was next? Oh, go Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think Arendt here is also, there's a distinction between poetry and the work of poetry and her criticism of political poetry, and the relationship that she's drawing between condensation and the thickness, in that sense of dict and verdict, and the trickiness, which is in part what makes it disruptive. It's also what allows it to appear. So poetry is both, it's constitutive, but it's also disruptive. And I think so it's also that, you know, it is a kind of positive sense of trickiness, in the sense that it's almost, you know, like a magic trick, to use that language, and making what is not visible through appearance in language. So I've always read the case of, you know, Brecht, and, you know, Markel's essay does this, and Jerome Cohn's essay on Arendt and Brecht does this, you know, is that poetic case, but also the case, the trial. And so taking apart the grammatical structure of the poet that gives it that thickness. Ken Crimstein, if I can unmute you.
Hi Ken, are you there?
Yep, you're good.
He got muted again somehow.
Mute? Okay, hi. Yeah, this is definitely an essay I'm going to read many, many more times. The first time I read it, I saw it as a takedown, and I thought it was really cunning, because I thought she really got at him where it hurt, his art. And I think it was kind of like condemning him for being a sellout, but worse than a sellout to Stalin. And I now, upon this discussion today, I mean, I want to read these other essays and stuff to try and figure it out. To me, as a maker of artistic product, I'm curious about the connection between moral right and quality in art, as we all are. So I want to examine that. But upon reading this, and especially the ending, Roger, and maybe Samantha and anybody else, you know, I want to look at this entire book as a narrative connected. I see this as, I mean, I don't remember all the essays completely, but I see he's the tragic hero of this book. I mean, he's wrong in the way that a tragic person is wrong. It's impossible to be an artist that gives back reality in the world and not be crippled. I mean, and that's a way of looking at it. And I guess
and not be crippled.
I mean, yeah, and maybe do sympathetics. I mean, what are you supposed to do? I mean, I hate to think that Arendt is agreeing with her good friend Theodor Adorno, saying that you can't make poetry after Auschwitz, and I don't think she is. But I think she's saying there's a limit to what a poet can express about, like, being a poet in dark times is a tragic occupation for some reason.
Well, I think that's clear. I mean, it's worth comparing a little bit. And next week, I think we'll spend some time talking a little bit about the whole book as well. But Isaac Dinesen, is another writer who she talks about in this book. Not to mention Lessing. A lot of the people, but they are of an earlier, slightly earlier generations. Some of them slightly, some of them more. I think the end, as you say, Ken, is makes it, very clear that it's very hard to be a poet in this century or at any other time, she says. Why that or at any other time? Because there's always going to be the temptation some temptation to engage. I mean, you know, fame, right? I mean, you know, both the Benjamin essay and the Brecht essay in some way begin with the question of fame. Fame is deeply corrosive for her, or at least fame in one's lifetime, because it puts one in. It makes it very hard to be remote, to be outside, and to be a conscious pariah. So how do you? I think one of the, I mean, I've given lectures at times to artist groups, and I've gotten a huge amount of anger and pushback on this aspect of Arendt. I mean, she really does believe that an artist has to be a pariah. To some degree, I mean, right? You know, I mean, there's degrees of pariahdom and there's degree of artists, but she does believe, you know, I mean, why does Arendt never take a job, a full-time job or tenure track job? Why does she always remain on the outside of the university, right? You know, she had a very difficult relation to prizes and awards, and she had and she says a lot of terrible things about people who grow up famous or children of famous people. You know, I do believe, you know, that it's not just in our times. The danger in our times, at least one of the dangers in our times, is compassion, right? And I think so many of us have to at least listen to what she says about compassion and the danger of the temptation of compassion. But I think at all times there are dangers that pull the artist into the world in ways that will compromise their ability to stand apart from it and say something new. You know, yeah. Does that sound? I mean, I don't know where you stand on all that, Ken. I mean, I think again, when I say this to artists, I mean, it's a very old-fashioned, in some way, very Germanic view of art, right? The artist has to be sort of this sort of hermit touched by a muse who, because they're touched by a divine inspiration, has a vision about the world that is different and new and true in ways that others don't. And I think it's a very anti-democratic in some sense. I mean, it's anti-democratic not in the sense that there are certain people born into it through aristocracy or oligarchy. That's not at all the case. But it's one that's not based in the idea that everyone is equally an artist. And there's, as a result, I get a lot of pushback, and I understand why, from artist groups when I talk about Arendt and art. Yeah, is that, you want to say something, Ken? Are you muted? He's muted.
I just unmuted him. I think we're playing a game of mute unmute.
Okay, I'll let you do it.
There's a lot of muting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't think the artist should get a free pass to not be a politically engaged person, but I think the relationship between the made product and political engagement is one that's very fraught. And that's all I can say. She privileges clearly good art, and she privileges inequality in certain ways. But I think it's interesting to think about the relationship between, you know, truth. You know, artists, you know, they say, oh, just tell the truth, and your stuff will be better. And Brecht, as somebody referred to before, was in this sort of roller coaster ride of truth. And I guess, I don't know, can you forgive him for that? Maybe you can forgive him personally, but his art, I don't know. I'm sorry, it's huge. Thank you, though.
Yeah, no, it's good. I know we started late because of the Zoom bombing. If there's Sam, is there one or two questions we should pull out of the chat?
We have 4 hands raised in the chat box. So we can try and ask people to be brief and take 2 at a time if you want to clear it, or we can start to maybe wrap up or ask them to post the questions in the chat box.
Yeah, we could also go to Slack, but let's let people, let's say very brief, so if people can sort of briefly state a question, or if they want to wait. We're also, I'll say that next week, the 2 essays we're reading are quite short, on Gurian and Jarrell, and I thought we'd also talk about the introduction, which we never really officially talked about, but we can come back to any of the essays in the book that people are interested in as well next week. So if there are questions you have, we can come back to it. But let's let a couple questions come out.
Great. So one person put their hand down. So Ben Holmes and then Dina.
Hey, okay. Am I unmuted?
You're unmuted. Yeah. You can hear
Great.
you.
So I was reminded in this essay too, when we were reading, well, when I was reading Eichmann in Jerusalem, sort of the criticism of some of the people involved in the court for not pursuing like capital J justice, sort of like this, like almost an abstract concept, but justice to its fullest, I guess, and attempting to make it a politicized kind of show. Do you think it's fair to say, or unfair to say, that she's pessimistic about the idea of including politics or a current political scene in any of like what you might call a grander pursuit, justice or art or something like that? Is that like too pure for politics, or is she thinking about it in some other way?
I think there's a difference. I think art is going to have a political impact for her, but the political impact does not depend on what the artist says. An artist has an idea. It's a new idea. If it's not a new idea and they put it into the world, it's not going to cause a stir. And if it doesn't cause a stir, it's not going to matter. So an artist, in order to cause a stir, has to have a new idea, which is one of the reasons they have to be a conscious pariah or remote. And once it causes a stir, it really is not up to the artists how people judge it. It's how it happens. And so at that point, the artist loses control of the work and has nothing more to say about it except as a citizen. I think that's the one side, that art is going to be political. Insofar as an artist tries to pursue a politics through their art will be bad art, according to Arendt. It won't have the kind of power. It will, in a sense, it will be normalized by being part of a political discourse. It therefore will not, almost by definition, insofar as it takes sides, will not do what great art should do, which is speak almost to everybody. It will speak to one side. It'll speak to the left or the right, or this or that. And as a result, it will be bad art. It will be shallow. And so it doesn't have it might become famous on the left or famous on the right, but it won't become a world-creating piece of art. And I think that's where she comes down on this. Are there one or two more? Dina?
Dina, yes, one more.
My question is actually absolutely related, and that is, if a great disappointment in Brecht is that he produced bad art at the end of his life, is that sin one against the gods who have imparted him with this great gift, or is it one against the world? Because having failed to live up to his potential at the end of his life, he's actually depleted the world of the great art he was capable of.
I don't think it's a sin against gods. I mean, I don't think either Brecht or Arendt are religious in that sense. I think it's I mean, who's it a sin against? I
mean, at times she's upset that he's thrown his gift away. I don't mean
it's a nice. Yeah, I mean, it could be it could be a sin against poetry, right? insofar as he is a poet who acts unpoetically. It could be a sin against himself, as in he's someone who should be more than what he did or achieved, but falls down to be an ox. And it could be, as you said, a sin against the world, insofar as it instead of saying what is, seeks to lie. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a sin against himself, though, which I think at times it does sound like that. And she's disappointed that he's become a hack at the end. Why do we care? I mean, it's just he just violates his own potential. Why is that of any relevance? Why write an essay about that?
I think that's a good question. I think it's because, as I was saying earlier, as citizens, we both need poets and we also are fearful of poets. And it's important that we have the ability to judge great poetry. Why? Because poetry will enliven and potentially revitalize and rejuvenate the world.
Right.
And poetry and art are those faculties, or poetry and art are those activities that put works into the world that can gather people around and revitalize a political and cultural world. And to that extent, we care about those who sin against poetry and sin against the world and sin against themselves as poets, I guess. But I think you're right. To the extent that we care about it in this essay, it's a sin against poetry as an essential part of the human world.
Right.
I'll stick with that for now. I want to thank you all for bearing with us. I'm very sorry about the initial Zoom bombing that happened. We will obviously come up with some new protocols to deal with this. I think I'd love people's advice. You can either stay on now and tell me or write to us. I think we'll probably have to do this. We admit people. It will be easier. It will be easier if you have your real name, so we can admit you. And everyone will be muted, and we'll unmute people when they have talks. I don't prefer this, but it seems that we need to do this, unless other people have a better solution. If you do, if you're technical, if you know a better solution, please write to us. Thank you. For next week, we're going to read the essay on Valdemar Gurian, and then the very short essay on Randall Jarrell. Because they're both so short, we'll also read the preface to the book, which we sort of skipped at the beginning. I mean, I talked a little bit about it, but we didn't read it closely. And any other questions you have about the book, we'll address. That will be next week. And then we're going to start essays and understanding. So enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you very much. Let me just ask the question, do people want a week break? So next week is what, June? Next week is the first week in June. So it'll be June 3rd. June 3rd. We could either then start on June 10th or June 17th with essays and understanding. Do people have I'm inclined to just keep going, June 10th. Is that all right? Or do people want to wait?
People are saying they want to keep going.
All right.
Unanimously.
So we will meet. So you should order Essays and Understanding if you don't have it for June 10th. And we will read Jarrell and Gurian and the preface for next week.
And Roger, we can get a link to a discounted version of that book through Oblong up on the website and in an email.
We will do that. Yeah. I'll ask Craig to do that ASAP. All right. Thank you all very much. If anyone has suggestions on how we deal with Zoom bombing, let me know. But I think we seem to have at least dealt with it somewhat. And I apologize. Bye, guys.
Daphne, you want to say? Are you raising your hand up,
God.
class?
Oh yeah. People can't.
I just want to say that I think Roger got the date wrong, because the next one would be June 12th.
Oh, okay. I apologize. So
no,
June 12th.
It would be June. Would it be June 12th?
I don't know.
It's June 3rd and then June 12th, I think, isn't it?
No, she's right. It's June 5th. June 5th.
Oh, I am.
June 5th and then June 5th and then June 12th.
Yeah, 5/12.
Okay, that's all.
Sorry.
All right. Thank you all. We're gonna have to get used to checking the hands up. I can't see all the hands, Sam, but we'll have to talk about how that worked.
We can. It's easy enough to. I think it's just a new function of conversation, and we can manage. I'm
right.
incredibly heartened that everybody signed back in, and we can also in the email send some instructions for raising the hand and renaming yourself when you join the future VRG groups.
But it doesn't seem to me that when people raise their hand, they rise to the top of the list in the participants, so it's hard to know whose hand you have to.
They do. Yes.
They do. Okay.
They do, and then they appear in the order that they raise their hands.
Okay, I hadn't noticed that, so that was part of the issue.
I think going forward, it might be best for us to split the icon.
Yeah, we may also actually ask someone to actually do this. Maybe a student or something. Okay. Oh, wow, that was very nerve-wracking at the beginning. Oh my God.
The Zoom bomber was not a poet, is all I have to say. No poetic quality there whatsoever.
Do you know who it was? I mean, they seem to know both of us, right? Quite well.
It's anonymous.
They had your name, right? They used your name?
Yeah, well, they were using our names as they signed in so that we would confuse them. You made one of them the host.
That's what, I obviously confused them. I mean, yeah, in the future, you and I have to sign on earlier and make each other hosts or whatever.
Yeah, we'll get used to it.
Wow, that was really nerve-wracking. But I appreciate all your I don't know what forbearance. Okay, well, I'm gonna go take a walk. Have a great day, everybody. And continue reading on our end. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Yeah, I unmuted everyone now.
Oh.
All right.
Hey, Samantha, while you're here, is there anything you need from me or anything?
No, I'm good. I will send you something soon. So
I have to say that's fine. That's fine. I'm just
looking forward to it.
I'm just trying to figure out what to do. I'm just learning as I go, kind of, and
you're doing an amazing.
This has been. Thanks. These sessions have been incredibly inspiring towards this, to make me understand what I'm doing. And, I'm just, So thank you. And also Brecht that essay was amazing. And Roger, your interpretation is so good. So informative.
I'm glad.
Do this right. And we're going
All right, I'm going to sign off. All right, take care, everyone.
Okay, bye.